He drove her home. That was all it was supposed to be. 10 minutes, maybe 12. A polite favor at the end of a night that already hurt more than he'd expected. But she didn't ask him to stop at her building. She asked him to keep going. And in the silence that followed, with the rain coming down hard against the windshield and the city lights bleeding into streaks across the glass, Landon Hayes made a decision he didn't fully understand yet. He kept driving. That one choice, so small, so quiet, unraveled everything he thought he'd buried, everything she'd never said out loud, and every version of the future neither of them had dared to want. If this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Part 1. The party. He should have skipped. The invitation had been sitting on his kitchen counter for 11 days. Landon noticed it every morning when he made coffee, propped against the fruit bowl his mother had given him, cream-colored cardstock with embossed lettering that probably cost more per sheet than his electric bill. You are cordially invited to celebrate the engagement of Melissa Crane and Daniel Foss. Below the date, in smaller print, dress code, cocktail attire, RSVP by the 14th. He hadn't RSVP'd. He told himself it was because he was busy, which was true. Between his job at the structural engineering firm and picking up his daughter Gracie from school and making sure she had clean clothes and a warm dinner and someone who actually listened when she talked about whatever she'd decided was important that week, which lately was a documentary series about deep-sea creatures that he'd watched 3 episodes of despite knowing absolutely nothing about marine biology. There wasn't a lot of room in his schedule for optional obligations, but that wasn't really why he hadn't RSVP'd. He just didn't know how to explain to himself why he was going to go anyway. His mother had helped him figure out what to wear. She'd come over on a Tuesday night under the pretense of bringing Gracie a birthday gift 2 weeks early, and she'd stood in the doorway of his bedroom with her arms crossed and her head tilted the way she did when she was about to say something he didn't want to hear. "The gray blazer," she said, "with the dark jeans, not the ones with the fraying on the left knee. I have one pair of dark jeans. I know which ones I mean. Mom, you're going to Melissa's engagement party." She said it like she was reading a weather report, calm, factual, slightly ominous. "You should look like you've moved on." "I have moved on." She gave him a look that was somehow both gentle and devastating. Then she went back out to the kitchen to help Gracie with her homework, and Landon stood there in front of his closet for a while, looking at the gray blazer. He'd been with Melissa Crane for 2 years and 8 months. They'd met at a work function. Her firm had hired his for a commercial project, and it had seemed at the time like the kind of relationship that made sense. She was smart and organized, and she laughed easily. She liked Gracie, or she'd seemed to. She'd taken Gracie to the zoo twice and helped her with a school project about weather patterns, and it had felt, for a few months, like they were all moving toward something. Then it had stopped feeling like that. He couldn't point to a single moment when it changed. There wasn't a fight that ended things, no dramatic confrontation, no one caught doing something unforgivable. It had just slowly become clear that what they were building wasn't what either of them actually wanted, and that neither of them had the courage to say that out loud until Melissa finally did, on a Thursday evening in March, while Gracie was at a sleepover and Landon was making pasta. "I don't think this is working." He'd stood there holding a wooden spoon and stared at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he'd said. "I know." That was it. No shouting, no tears, no thrown objects, just a quiet acknowledgement of something they'd both known for a while. She'd taken her box of things 3 days later, and that was the end of it. What surprised him, afterward, was that the part that hurt most wasn't losing Melissa. It was losing the idea of what he'd been trying to build. Another shot at the kind of family Gracie deserved. Another person who might stick around. He'd been 30 when that happened, 2 years ago, and he was fine. He was genuinely fine. He repeated that to himself in the car on the way to the party. The venue was a rooftop event space in the Midtown district, the kind of place that had exposed brick and Edison bulbs and a bar that served drinks with names he didn't understand. It was already crowded when he arrived, which was a relief. Crowds meant he could drift through without being too visible, pay his respects, say something appropriate to Melissa and her new fiancé, and leave before it got weird. He got a drink, bourbon, because it seemed simpler than looking at the cocktail menu. He found a spot near the edge of the rooftop where the city spread out below in its usual contradictory way, all light and noise and density, all those lives stacked on top of each other in glass towers, each one completely separate from the rest. He'd been standing there about 6 minutes when someone stepped up beside him. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," said Victoria Sterling. Landon turned. She was standing a foot away in a dark green dress, holding a glass of white wine, looking out at the city the same way he had been. Her hair was down. He'd never seen her with her hair down at one of these things. "I almost didn't," he said. "But you did." "I did." Victoria Sterling had been Melissa's best friend since college, which meant Landon had known her peripherally for nearly 3 years. Seen her at group dinners, crossed paths at birthday parties, exchanged polite conversation at the kind of social events that seemed designed to put people in the same room without giving them any real reason to talk. She was the CEO of a mid-sized investment firm called Meridian Capital that had apparently been doubling its portfolio for the past 4 years. Everyone in Melissa's circle treated her with a specific kind of deference that had less to do with her money than with the way she carried herself, like she'd decided exactly who she was and hadn't second-guessed it since. He'd always found her slightly intimidating, not in a way he'd ever said out loud. "Have you talked to Melissa yet?" Victoria asked. "I'm working up to it." "She's on the other side of the room, near the bar. She's been watching the door since you walked in." Landon glanced across the rooftop. Melissa was standing with a group of people he half recognized, laughing at something, but her eyes moved toward him at almost the same moment he looked. She gave a small, careful wave. He gave one back. "This is a strange thing to attend," he said. "I imagine it is." "Did she tell you I was coming?" "She told me she'd invited you." Victoria took a sip of her wine. "She seemed surprised you'd said yes." "I didn't actually say yes. I just showed up." Victoria looked at him sideways. There was something in that look, something that lasted maybe a second longer than it needed to. And then she turned back to the city. "That's sort of brave, actually. Or stupid. Maybe both." They stood there a little longer than they probably should have. Below them, the city kept doing what it always did. The party moved the way parties like that always moved. In slow cycles of introductions and small talk and maneuvering around people you didn't know well enough to ignore, but not well enough to actually talk to. Landon circulated. He shook hands with Daniel Foss, who turned out to be a genuinely decent guy. Tall, a little nervous, the kind of man who made too much eye contact because he'd probably been told once that it conveyed confidence. He talked for a few minutes with a couple of Melissa's coworkers about something in the news. He got a second drink. He and Melissa crossed paths near the appetizer table around the 2-hour mark. She looked beautiful, which he noticed and immediately decided not to think too hard about. The engagement ring on her hand caught the light every time she moved. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "You said that in the invitation." "I think." "I said I hoped you would." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "There's a difference." "Right." He looked at the table. There were small toasts with something orange on them. He had no idea what. "Congratulations, seriously, Melissa. He seems like a good guy." "He is." She said it with a warmth that was genuine and a little unguarded. "He's a really good guy." "Then I'm glad." She studied his face for a moment, the way she sometimes had, looking for whatever was going on underneath the surface. Old habit. "How's Gracie?" she asked. "She's obsessed with deep-sea creatures right now. She informed me last week that the anglerfish female is 6 times larger than the male, and that the male essentially fuses itself to the female and just becomes part of her biology." Melissa laughed. "That's either fascinating or deeply disturbing." "Both, honestly." She seemed delighted by it. "That sounds like her." The warmth in Melissa's expression shifted slightly into something more careful. "She's lucky to have you, Landon. She really is." He didn't know what to do with that, so he just said thank you and reached for one of the toasts. "What?" He found Victoria again near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned enough that the remaining guests were mostly standing in clusters, the energy winding down. She was near the door looking at her phone, then putting it away, then doing it again. the specific restlessness of someone trying to figure out how to leave gracefully. "You need a cab?" he asked. She looked up. "What?" "I'm leaving. I've got my car. If you need a ride, it's not a problem." She hesitated. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. Do you need a ride?" Another hesitation, shorter this time. "Yeah, actually, that would be... Yes, thank you." He texted his mother, who was watching Gracie, to let her know he was on his way. Then they said their goodbyes and took the elevator down and walked through the building lobby in a silence that felt oddly comfortable given how little they actually knew each other. His car was parked 2 blocks down. It was an 8-year-old Volvo SUV with a cracked dashboard panel he'd been meaning to replace for a year and a half, and a collection of Gracie's drawings still in the back seat from a road trip they'd taken to visit his parents 3 months ago. He thought about apologizing for the mess, and then decided not to, because it wasn't actually that messy, and apologizing for your own car was a weird thing to do. Victoria gave him the address, and he plugged it into his phone. Her apartment was in the east side, about 20 minutes, depending on traffic. They pulled out onto the street. For the first few minutes, they talked about nothing. Whether the party had felt long to her too. Whether the appetizers had been good, they'd both ended up agreeing on the toasts, they hadn't loved them. She'd noticed that Daniel Foss seemed like a decent person. He'd thought the same. Then the conversation drifted and slowed, the way conversation does in a car late at night when the city outside is doing something cinematic without trying to. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Yeah." "Was it hard, being there tonight?" He thought about it honestly instead of reaching for the automatic answer. "Not the way I expected," he said finally. "I thought it was going to feel like, I don't know, a door closing. But it didn't really. It just felt like something that happened, you know? A version of things that didn't work out." "That's a healthy way to think about it." "Don't tell me that. It makes me feel like I'm in a therapy brochure." She laughed. It was an unguarded laugh. Not the polished social version he'd heard at the party, but something that surprised her slightly, like she hadn't planned on finding that funny. "Fair enough." "What about you?" he said. "Was it hard? You've known her a long time." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved past. "I love Melissa," she said carefully. "She's been my friend for 15 years, but tonight was a little complicated for me, for reasons that aren't really about her." He didn't push it. He wasn't the kind of person who pushed. They were getting close to her street. He could see the intersection coming up, and he eased up slightly on the gas, the way you do when you're not quite ready for something to end, but you're not sure what else to do about it. And then she said, "Can you just keep driving past my street? For a little while. I'm not ready to be inside yet." He looked at her briefly. Her eyes were straight ahead, watching the road. He drove past her street. The rain started about 10 minutes later. Not the dramatic kind. No thunder, no sudden downpour. Just a quiet escalation from nothing to a thin, persistent drizzle that covered the windshield in seconds. He turned on the wipers. The rhythm of them became the rhythm of the next stretch of silence. "I've been thinking," Victoria said, "about what it means to want something for a long time and never say anything." He wasn't sure if she was talking about him or about herself. He said, "What kind of something?" "The kind you talk yourself out of." She was looking out the passenger window. Her profile in the streetlight had an edge to it, something complicated in the jaw, in the set of her mouth. The kind where you build up this whole case for why it's not a good idea, and eventually you believe the case more than you believe the original feeling. Landon drove. "Does it work?" he said. "The case?" "Sometimes. Sometimes you just get very good at not thinking about it." A long stretch of silence. The wipers kept moving. "Victoria." "Yeah." "Are you telling me something?" She didn't answer immediately. She shifted in her seat. Not toward him, not away, just a small readjustment, like she was settling in for something difficult. Then she said, "I don't know. I think I might be." He pulled into a small parking lot off the main road, one of those unmarked ones beside a laundromat that was closed for the night. He didn't make a big deal of stopping. He just pulled in and cut the engine and let the rain do what it was doing. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said back. Neither of them moved. Then Victoria turned to look at him, and there was something in her face that he'd never seen there before. Something stripped of the professional composure, the boardroom steadiness, all of it. She just looked like a person. A tired person who'd been holding something for a long time and wasn't sure she could keep holding it. "I don't know when exactly it happened," she said. "That's always the thing with feelings you try not to have. They don't announce themselves. They just sort of—" She shook her head. "I noticed you were patient with Gracie in a way that wasn't for show. I noticed that you were always the one in the group who actually listened when someone was talking instead of waiting for your turn. And I noticed that you never tried to be impressive. You were just there." She paused. "I think that's when." Landon was very still. "I'm telling you this," she continued, "because I'm 30 years old and I've spent a significant portion of my life being strategic about things. And I think I've been strategic about the wrong things." "I was dating Melissa," he said. "I know. For almost 3 years." "I know, Landon. I was there for all of it." He ran a hand over his jaw. "What did you do with it? What you're describing?" "I buried it. Told myself it wasn't real, that I was just projecting because you were kind, and I was lonely, and it was easier to romanticize someone unavailable than to actually go find someone available." She said it flatly, like she'd rehearsed the debunking of it so many times it had its own script. "But then you and Melissa ended, and I thought, okay, so now there's no excuse, and then I still didn't say anything for 2 years." "Why not?" "Because what was I supposed to say? Hey, you just got out of a long relationship with my best friend, and also I've apparently had feelings for you for an unknown amount of time. Would you like to complicate both our lives?" "I mean, when you put it like that," she almost smiled. "Not quite. See, that's the thing. You're funny without trying to be." He looked at her for a long moment. The rain on the roof of the car made a sound like white noise, like the world had narrowed down to just this parking lot, this moment, this person looking at him like she was afraid of what he was going to say and more afraid of what she'd already said. "I have to tell you something," he said. She waited. "After Melissa and I ended." He stopped, started again. "There was a period where I was not doing great, not in a crisis, nothing like that. I was fine. But Gracie was 6, and I was working a lot, and I was tired in this specific way that has less to do with sleep and more to do with, I don't know, carrying things by yourself for a long time." "Yeah," Victoria said quietly. "I know that feeling. And I ran into you at that gallery opening, Melissa's Friends thing. You remember that? The one with the abstract sculptures that looked like car accidents." "Yes. And we talked for about 40 minutes at the bar, and you asked me what Gracie's favorite movie was that week. And you actually listened when I told you, and when I left, I sat in my car for 10 minutes and thought about you." He said it the way you say something you've been not saying for a long time. Not dramatically, just honestly. And I decided to stop thinking about it, because you were Melissa's best friend, and that was, what's the alternative? So I just decided not to. Victoria's breath shifted. Subtle, but he heard it. "And you're telling me this now," she said, because you just told me the truth, and I don't think the least I can do is less than that." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The laundromat sign buzzed faintly. The rain hadn't let up. "This is a very strange night," Victoria said. "Yeah. I came to an engagement party, and now I'm sitting in a parking lot having the most honest conversation I've had in years." "The appetizers weren't even good," he said. This time she laughed fully, leaned back against the headrest and laughed, and it cut right through the tension like something physical. And then she was just looking at him again, still smiling, and the smile was the most unguarded thing about her. "What do we do with this?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "I genuinely don't know." "That's terrifying." "A little bit, yeah." Ito, they didn't resolve anything that night. That wasn't really an option given where they were. In a parking lot, in the rain, coming from a party that represented exactly the tangled history sitting between them. But before he drove her back to her building, they talked for another hour and 20 minutes. About things that didn't seem to connect but somehow did. about what she'd actually wanted when she'd started Meridian Capital and how it differed from what she had now. About Gracie's phase of asking difficult questions that had no real answers, like why some people were mean to their kids and whether fish experienced loneliness. About the specific feeling of standing in a crowd of people and being fundamentally unreachable. Victoria talked with her hands when she wasn't thinking about it. He noticed that. She had opinions about things that she delivered with certainty and then immediately questioned. She was not as composed as she seemed from a distance. Up close, she was constantly processing, constantly reconsidering, constantly at work on something internal. He found that interesting in a way he hadn't expected. When he finally stopped in front of her building, the rain was still coming down. She gathered her things, put her hand on the door handle. Landon. Yeah. I meant everything I said. I'm not going to... I don't do things like that and then pretend I didn't. I know, he said. Me neither. She nodded, got out of the car, stood on the sidewalk for a second in the rain, looking back at him through the open door with an expression he couldn't fully read. Something between resolve and uncertainty, between arrival and the beginning of a much longer trip. Good night, she said. Good night, Victoria. She closed the door. He sat there until she was inside the building, then sat there a little longer for no reason he could name. Then he drove home through the rain, through the empty streets, past the city doing what the city always does. Indifferent, continuous, glittering. He drove past a 24-hour diner with neon signs and a parking lot that was half full at 1 a.m. He drove past the park where he took Gracie on weekends. He drove past a version of his own life that felt for the first time in a long time like it had more in it than he'd been accounting for. He pulled into his driveway at 1:14 a.m. His mother's car was still there. The kitchen light was still on. He sat in the car for a moment. Then he went inside. His mother was asleep on the couch with a book on her chest, and Gracie was in her bed with her nightlight on, one arm thrown over the stuffed seal she'd had since she was 3. He stood in the doorway of her room for a minute, the way he always did, watching her breathe, doing that specific kind of accounting that parents do in quiet moments, the unconscious tally of what they would do to keep this person safe. He pulled her door halfway closed, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, stood at the window over the sink and looked at the rain coming down in the backyard, hitting the old swing set he'd been meaning to replace, turning the grass into something black and silver under the floodlight. He thought about a woman in a dark green dress asking him to drive past her street. He thought about the gallery opening. He thought about 40 minutes at a bar and the way she'd asked about Gracie's favorite movie with genuine interest, not the performative interest people sometimes applied to other people's children as a social courtesy. He thought about how long he'd been carrying this particular piece of silence and how much lighter it felt now that he'd set it down in a parking lot in the rain. His phone buzzed on the counter, a text from an unknown number. This is Victoria. I should have asked for your number a long time ago. Good night again. He stared at it for a second. Then he typed back, yeah, you should have. A pause, then, don't push it, Hayes. He smiled at his phone in his kitchen at 1:30 in the morning. Then he turned off the light and went to bed. He didn't sleep particularly well, not because of anxiety exactly, more like that specific restlessness that comes when something has shifted and your body hasn't quite caught up to what your mind already knows. He lay there, listening to the rain against the window, thinking about all the ordinary ways a life rearranges itself, all the decisions that look small from the outside. A text returned, a parking lot chosen, a street driven past, that turned out to have been the thing. He was 32 years old. He had a daughter who loved anglerfish, and a job he was good at, and a cracked dashboard, and a mother who showed up when he needed her, and a kitchen that was never quite as clean as he meant it to be. He had a life that had not gone the way he'd planned, and that had somehow, incrementally, unpredictably, become something real anyway. At some point, the rain slowed and then stopped. Landon Hayes closed his eyes. He woke up to Gracie standing at the edge of his bed, with her stuffed seal tucked under one arm, and her hair in the specific state of chaos that only happened after a full night of sleep. The kind of chaos that would take 15 minutes to brush out and approximately 4 arguments to accomplish. There's no milk, she announced. Good morning to you too. I checked twice, the carton is empty. Okay. He sat up slowly the way he always did, feeling the particular weight of 40-something years of obligation pressing down through the mattress. He was 32. He felt older some mornings. "We'll go get some." "Grandma left." "I know, she texted me." Gracie stood there with her seal, considering him. She had his coloring, the dark hair, the slightly too serious expression that people sometimes mistook for unfriendliness, and Melissa's restlessness, which wasn't genetic, but 8-year-olds absorbed things from the people around them whether you wanted them to or not. "You came home really late," she said. "I was at a party." "For Melissa?" He looked at her. "How do you know about that?" "Grandma told me." She said it without particular emotion, just information. "She said you were being brave." Landon didn't know what to do with that at 7:15 on a Saturday morning, so he just said, "Get your shoes on, we'll go to the corner store." And Gracie accepted this with the philosophical flexibility that children occasionally produce when you least expect it. They walked to the corner store in the thin early light. Gracie in her rain boots, because she always chose her rain boots on days that didn't require them. Landon with his hands in his jacket pockets and his coffee-deprived brain doing something slow and partial. The neighborhood was quiet. The rain from the night before had left the streets washed and slightly reflective, and the air had that specific post-rain smell that wasn't quite clean, but wasn't quite city either. Something in between. "Dad," Gracie said, stepping deliberately into a puddle, "do you think anglerfish are lonely?" "We talked about this." "We talked about whether fish feel lonely. I'm asking specifically about anglerfish." "I think anglerfish are too focused on survival to have time for loneliness." She considered this. "That might be true for people too." He looked down at her. "Yeah," he said. "That might be." He bought milk and a newspaper he wouldn't read, and a pack of peanut butter crackers that Gracie put in the basket with the focused intentionality of someone making an important acquisition. On the walk back, she held his hand without being asked, which she only did occasionally now at 8, still sometimes, but not automatically, the way she'd done at 5, and he had learned to notice the times it happened without drawing attention to it, because drawing attention to it made her self-conscious, and then she stopped. He thought about Victoria exactly once on that walk home. Then he thought about the text she'd sent. Then he thought about something else. He was good at not dwelling. He'd had to get good at it. She texted him on Sunday afternoon. He was at the park with Gracie, sitting on a bench while she navigated the climbing structure with 2 kids she'd met approximately 4 minutes earlier and befriended with the terrifying efficiency of an 8-year-old who had no concept of social barriers. His phone was in his lap, and he'd been watching a pigeon with a broken-seeming gait make its way across the path with enormous dignity when the notification came up. "Are you doing anything Thursday evening?" He stared at it for a second. "Depends on what you have in mind," he typed back. A pause. Then, "Dinner. Actual dinner, not an engagement party with bad appetizers, if you're interested." He looked up at Gracie, who had somehow become the de facto leader of the climbing structure operation in the last 3 minutes, and was now directing the other 2 kids on structural load-bearing with what sounded like genuine authority. She got that from him, he supposed, the engineering instinct. "I'm interested," he sent back. The response took longer this time. He watched the pigeon complete its dignified crossing of the path and disappear under a bench. "Good. I'll figure out where and let you know." He put his phone back in his pocket. "Dad," Gracie called from the top of the climbing structure. "Look!" "I see you," he called back. "I'm the highest." "I see." She looked enormously pleased about this. The other 2 kids looked at her with a mixture of admiration and mild resentment that she completely failed to notice. He sat back on the bench and tilted his face toward the pale Sunday sky and thought briefly that the world was a strange and occasionally decent place. Thursday arrived the way Thursdays do when you're counting up to them. Slowly, and then all at once. He told his mother he needed her to watch Gracie for the evening, and she'd said of course and hadn't asked any questions, which meant she was either being unusually restrained or she already somehow knew. With his mother, it was difficult to tell the difference. Victoria had chosen a restaurant in the warehouse district, a converted space with high ceilings and low lighting, and a menu that leaned Italian without being a stereotype of Italian. Not so fancy that it announced itself as a significant occasion, Not so casual that it seemed like an accident. He appreciated the calibration. He'd thought about it. She was already there when he arrived, which surprised him slightly. He'd arrived 3 minutes early. She was sitting at a corner table with a glass of sparkling water, looking at her phone, wearing a dark blazer over a simple shirt with her hair pulled back. When she saw him come through the door, she put the phone face down on the table. He liked that, the phone going face down. "You're early," he said, sitting down. "I'm always early." She said it like it was a minor personal failing. "I was 10 minutes early for the engagement party. I stood outside for 6 minutes before going in so I wouldn't seem compulsive." "That's very compulsive." "I know." She picked up her water. "How was your week?" "It was fine. We had a project review that ran 2 hours over and Gracie decided she wants to learn chess, so I've been looking up how to teach an 8-year-old chess when I don't actually play chess. There are YouTube channels for that. I've watched 4 of them. They all contradict each other." "That tracks." She smiled slightly. "Is she good at things quickly?" "Gracie?" "She's either immediately good at things or completely uninterested in them after 20 minutes. There's no middle ground. It's exhausting and kind of amazing." She sounds like she has very strong preferences. She has opinions about everything. She's had opinions about everything since she was 4. I don't know how she decided on all of them that fast, but they're apparently firm. The waiter came and they ordered drinks and spent a few minutes with the menu, and it was during this ordinary interval, the kind of quiet, slightly awkward settling into a restaurant that happens even when you want to be somewhere, that Landon noticed he wasn't nervous exactly. He was alert in a way that felt different from anxiety, like his attention had been turned up without the accompanying static. "Can I ask you something?" he said after the waiter had left with their orders. "You keep opening with that, but yes." "How did your week go?" "Actually, not just fine." Victoria set her water down. She looked at him with an expression that flickered briefly into something caught off guard, then settled. "Honestly?" "Yeah. We're in the middle of negotiating an acquisition deal that's about to fall apart because the other party keeps moving the goal line, and I spent Wednesday in a 6-hour meeting that should have been a 45-minute meeting. And I found out that one of my senior analysts has been undermining a junior colleague for about 3 months and nobody told me. So now I have to deal with that, which is..." She stopped, picked up her water again. "It's fine. It's just work." "It doesn't sound fine." "I said the word fine. That doesn't mean I think it's fine. It means I'm used to it." He looked at her. What would not being used to it look like? She blinked. It was a small thing, but he caught it, the tiny hesitation before she recovered. "I genuinely don't know," she said. "That's kind of the point." The food came eventually, and they ate and talked, and the conversation moved the way conversations do when 2 people are both being more honest than they're used to being, with a kind of momentum that surprised them intermittently, that caught them off guard in small ways. She told him about starting Meridian Capital at 26 with 1 client and a business plan she'd revised 47 times. He told her about the first building project he'd ever led, how he'd been so terrified of making a structural error that he'd triple-checked everything and still had nightmares about it for 6 months. She laughed at that, not dismissively, but with recognition. "That's the worst kind of fear," she said, "the one where you've done everything right and you're still scared." "What kind of fear do you have?" She twisted her fork slightly. "The kind where you've worked very hard to build something and you realize you can't tell anymore whether you built it because you wanted it or because it was the clearest proof of something you needed to prove." He let that sit without immediately responding, which he could tell she'd expected him not to do. She glanced up at him. "Most people say, that's not true, you clearly love what you do," she said. "Do you love what you do?" "I think I love parts of it. I think other parts of it have just become how I identify myself, which isn't the same thing." She paused. "That's not a comfortable thing to say out loud." "I appreciate that you said it anyway." She looked at him steadily. "You do that thing where you don't rush to fix things. Is that a good thing?" "It's a disorienting thing. I'm not used to it." She picked up her fork again. "People usually either try to fix it or they get uncomfortable and change the subject. I have an 8-year-old who asks unanswerable questions regularly. I've had to learn to just sit in the question." Tell me one. One of her questions? Yeah. He thought about it. Last month she asked me why people who love each other sometimes hurt each other the most. He said it matter-of-factly. She'd seen something at school, some friend situation, and I sat there for a minute and I told her I didn't have a great answer, but that I thought it had something to do with how much more we expect from people we love, how we let ourselves need them in ways we don't let ourselves need anyone else. So when they fall short, it lands harder. And she listened very carefully and then said, "That seems like a design flaw," and went back to her homework. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "She's not wrong," she said. "She's rarely wrong. It's a problem." He watched her smile at that. A real one, slow and genuine, the kind that took a second to fully arrive. And for a moment he just let himself be aware of how strange and specific this was, sitting across from this person in a restaurant he'd never been to, having a conversation that felt more real than most conversations he could remember having in years. "I thought about you," she said, more quietly. "After Saturday night, I thought about telling you I'd overshared and could we just pretend I hadn't." "Why didn't you?" "Because I would have been lying, and I'm tired of lying to myself about this particular thing." She met his eyes. "And because you drove past my street. You asked me to. You didn't have to." He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't." The check came eventually, and they argued briefly about it, not with any real heat, just the low-level negotiation of two people who'd both been handling things themselves for long enough that splitting a bill required a small production. And then they were outside, standing on the sidewalk in the cool night air with the warehouse district's converted lamps doing their atmospheric thing around them. "I have to ask you something," Victoria said. They were standing maybe 3 feet apart, which felt both appropriate and slightly insufficient. "And I need you to be honest." "Okay. What are you actually looking for here?" She asked it directly, no softening. "I'm not asking because I want to define something. I'm asking because I'm 30 years old and I have spent time on things that weren't real, and I'm not interested in doing that again." Landon thought about it. He thought about the way he'd been handling things for 2 years. The evenings with Gracie, the weekend routines, the responsible management of a life that worked, but sometimes felt sealed from the inside. He thought about Saturday night in the parking lot and how it had felt to set something down that he'd been carrying without really acknowledging. "I don't know what it looks like yet," he said, "but I know it's not casual. I'm not looking for something casual." "Okay?" She said it with a long exhale. "Good. Is that the right answer?" "It's the honest answer. Those are usually the same thing." They stood there another moment. Above them, the city was doing its nighttime thing. The ambient noise, the impossible light that never quite went dark, the anonymous movement of 1,000 lives all going somewhere. "I should get home," he said. "Gracie goes to bed at 9 on school nights and my mother's been there since 6. "Of course." She nodded. Then after a beat, "She's lucky. Gracie." "People keep saying that." "Because it's true." He looked at her. "I think she'd like you," he said, "for what that's worth. She'd ask you difficult questions and argue with your answers and then decide you were interesting." Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Something he couldn't quite name, but it looked like it mattered to her in a way she hadn't quite expected. "Good night, Landon," she said. "Good night." He walked back to his car. He didn't look back immediately, but when he reached the corner and glanced over his shoulder, she was still standing on the sidewalk. She raised her hand slightly. He did the same. Then he turned the corner, and the warehouse district gave way to the regular city, and he drove home with the heater on low and the radio off, thinking about the particular weight of honesty, how it was heavier than a lie going in and lighter coming out. Thinking about a woman who ran a company and still didn't know what she'd built it for. Thinking about a conversation he was going to need to have at some point, not tonight, not yet, about things left unsaid 2 years ago when he'd been standing in a kitchen making pasta and choosing the easier thing. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet, but he was beginning to feel the shape of it, the way you feel weather coming before it arrives. He pulled into his driveway at 9:20. His mother was in the kitchen washing a mug, and she looked up when he came in. She didn't say anything. She just watched his face for a second, the way she always did. that specific inventory she'd been running on him his whole life. And then she dried her hands and said, "Gracie's asleep. She wanted me to tell you she figured out how the rook moves." Did she? She seemed very satisfied about it. She would. His mother picked up her bag, paused at the door. "You look different," she said. "I just went to dinner." "I know." She kissed him on the cheek. "Good night, baby." She left and the house settled into its particular late-night silence, and Landon stood in the kitchen for a moment just breathing. Then he turned off the lights, checked on Gracie, asleep, the seal tucked under her arm, the nightlight throwing its small yellow circle on the wall, and went to bed. This time, he slept. The weeks that followed had a specific texture to them, not the dramatic sweep of something new beginning, but the quieter, more complicated reality of two people trying to figure out what they were to each other while their actual lives kept running in parallel and didn't pause to accommodate the process. They texted most days. Not constantly, neither of them was built for constant contact, and they'd each figured that out about the other fairly quickly without having to say it explicitly. But there was a regularity to it that Landon found himself counting on without quite meaning to. A message from her in the morning about something she'd read, a response from him at lunch, a longer exchange in the evenings after Gracie was in bed, when they both had a little more room to think. She came to the park with him and Gracie on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks after the dinner. It had been Landon's suggestion, offered carefully, not as a declaration of anything but as a practical step. Because the conversation they'd been building couldn't keep living entirely in restaurants and text messages, and because there was no version of his life that didn't centrally involve the 8-year-old who was currently trying to teach her stuffed seal to play chess. He'd told Gracie that a friend was coming. Gracie had asked which friend. He'd said Victoria, from the party. Gracie had processed this for approximately 4 seconds and then said, "Okay," and gone back to her book, which was either good parenting on his part or a commentary on Gracie's capacity for unconditional acceptance. Probably both. Victoria had arrived at the park 5 minutes early, which he'd expected. She was wearing jeans and a jacket and looked slightly less certain of herself than she usually did, which he hadn't expected and which made him like her more. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He nodded toward the climbing structure where Gracie was already in motion. "She knows you're coming." She didn't have strong feelings about it either way, which is actually the best outcome with her. That's reassuring, I think. It is. If she'd had strong feelings, we'd know about it. Gracie noticed Victoria from the top of the climbing structure with the peripheral awareness children deploy when they're pretending not to be paying attention. She climbed down with the specific casualness of someone who has decided to be casual and made her way over. "Hi," she said, looking up at Victoria. "Hi," Victoria said. "I'm Victoria." "I know, my dad told me." Gracie tilted her head. "Do you play chess?" "I know how to play. I'm not especially good at it." "My dad's teaching me, but he had to look up the rules first, so he's not a real teacher." She said this without any particular judgment. "Do you want to see what I know?" "Sure." They sat at a picnic table for 40 minutes while Gracie demonstrated everything she'd learned about chess, which was substantial and partially incorrect in ways that Landon had apparently also been getting wrong. Victoria, to her credit, engaged with complete seriousness, asking questions, accepting corrections, offering a few observations that Gracie received with the focused evaluation of someone taking a professional consultation. Landon sat across from them and watched. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting. Maybe the slight performance quality that adults sometimes adopted around children, the heightened cheerfulness that was kind but slightly off-key. Victoria didn't do that. She just talked to Gracie the way she talked to anyone, with full attention and without condescension, and Gracie, who had exquisitely calibrated radar for condescension, responded to this by being exactly herself, which was a better outcome than most adults managed. Later, while Gracie ran off to the climbing structure again, Victoria sat back on the bench and let out a long breath. "She's a lot," she said, and immediately looked like she wasn't sure if that was the right thing to say. "No, you're right," Landon said. "She's a lot. She's been a lot since she was 2 years old. I've gotten used to it. I mean it as a compliment. She's completely herself. I didn't know 8-year-olds could be that completely themselves. She's always been that way." I don't know where it came from. Victoria looked at him. I do, she said. He didn't answer that, but he felt it. The thing that happened came without warning, the way the things that matter most usually do. It was a Tuesday evening in mid-November. Landon was in the kitchen making dinner. Chicken, rice, the reliable domesticity of a meal he could make without thinking, while Gracie sat at the table doing homework with the focused resentment that homework reliably inspired. His phone was on the counter. It lit up with a message from Melissa. He hadn't heard from her since the engagement party. Not directly. Victoria had mentioned her occasionally, the comfortable shorthand of someone referencing a person who existed in the shared background of their lives. But Melissa herself had been quiet, which he'd taken as mutual agreement that they'd said what needed to be said, and could now simply exist in the same general world without additional contact. The message said, "Hey, I need to talk to you about something. Can you call me when you have a minute? Not urgent, just, I think Victoria should probably know something, and I think it should come from you." He stood at the stove and read it twice. Gracie looked up from her homework. "The rice is going to burn." "It's fine." He turned the heat down. He set the phone on the counter face down. Then he picked it up again and read it again and put it down again. "Dad, I see the rice, Gracie." He got through dinner. He got through homework review and bath time, and the nightly negotiation about how many pages of reading constituted an acceptable bedtime routine. He got through the stuffed seal being relocated 3 times to different positions until Gracie was satisfied with the arrangement. He got through all of it on the autopilot that single parents develop out of sheer survival, the part of you that keeps running the routine even when another part of you is somewhere else entirely. When Gracie was asleep, he called Melissa. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He sat down at the kitchen table. "What's going on?" A pause. "How are things with you and Victoria?" Melissa. "I know, I'm getting there. How are things?" "They're good. We've been seeing each other. It's early." "Yeah." Another pause. Longer. "I'm glad. I mean that, Landon. I'm genuinely glad. Victoria deserves something real. She hasn't had that." "What did you need to tell me?" He heard her exhale. "You remember when we were together, that period maybe 8 months in when things were kind of rocky between you and me? We weren't fighting, but we weren't right either, and I think we both knew it, but neither of us was saying it." He remembered. That specific stretch when things had begun to feel slightly off-key, and they'd both been pretending not to notice. "Yeah," he said. "I went to Victoria. I asked her point blank if she had feelings for you." Melissa said it quickly, like she'd been practicing getting it out. "I'd noticed the way she was around you, the way she'd get quiet sometimes when you were in the room, and I don't know what I thought. I was scared, and I wanted to understand what was happening, and I went to her." Landon was very still. "She said no," Melissa continued. "She told me there was nothing there, that I was imagining it, that you were my partner, and she would never... She said everything you'd want a best friend to say." A beat. "And then about a week later, I ran into you at her firm's holiday thing, and I asked you about her casually. I said something like, 'Does Victoria ever seem different to you? Has anything ever seemed off between you two?' And you said no." "I remember," he said quietly. "But it wasn't entirely true, was it?" He sat with that. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights moving across the kitchen wall. "I'd noticed her," he said finally. "I hadn't let myself do anything with it. I pushed it down. When you asked, I said no, because saying anything else would have... It felt like it would have blown up things I didn't want to blow up." "I know." Melissa's voice had something complicated in it. Not anger exactly, something older than anger. "I figured that out later, much later. And I'm not calling to relitigate it or to make you feel bad about what we were. But Victoria doesn't know that conversation happened, either of them. She doesn't know that I went to her with that question, and she definitely doesn't know that she told me there was nothing there, and then you confirmed it when I checked." The silence that followed had a specific weight. "She protected you," Landon said. "She told you what you needed to hear." "She protected both of you, or she thought she was." Melissa paused. "Or she was protecting herself." "I don't know, Landon. I've thought about it a lot, and I think the truth is all three of those things were happening at once. Why are you telling me this now? Because she's your person. I can see that already, even from the outside. And because if you're building something real with her, it should be on ground that's actually real. Her voice was careful and tired in equal measure. She told me no when the true answer was more complicated than that. And you told me no when the true answer was more complicated than that. And I think she deserves to know what actually happened, and I think you should be the one to tell her. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time after they hung up. The house made its nighttime sounds, the heat cycling on, Gracie turning over in her bed, the refrigerator's low hum. He thought about a parking lot in the rain, and Victoria's voice saying, "I've been thinking about what it means to want something for a long time and never say anything." He thought about all the ways people held things quietly to protect each other and themselves simultaneously, and how often that protection cost more than it saved. He thought about Melissa asking Victoria a direct question, and Victoria looking her in the eyes and saying no, there's nothing there. He thought about Melissa asking him a sideways version of the same question, and him saying no without missing a beat. Two people who'd wanted the same thing, both lying about it to the same third person in the same 8-day window, without knowing the other was doing it. It would have been almost absurd if it hadn't hurt the way it did. He called Victoria the next morning after Gracie was at school. "Can we talk tonight?" he said. "In person." A brief pause. "That sounds serious." "It is. It's not bad exactly, but it's something I should tell you, and I should tell you face to face." Another pause. "Okay," she said. "Come over. 7. Her apartment was in a building with a doorman and an elevator that moved slowly and a hallway that smelled like fresh paint. He'd been here once before, briefly, to pick her up when her car was in the shop. He'd waited in the lobby. This was the first time he'd been inside. It was a real apartment, not a showroom. There were books on actual shelves in a configuration that suggested use rather than display, and a jacket over the back of a chair, and a coffee mug on the counter that hadn't made it to the dishwasher yet. A pair of reading glasses on the side table. He noticed these things because they were the kinds of details that told you the truth about a person in ways they didn't intend. She made tea. He didn't particularly want tea, but he accepted it because the ritual of it gave them both somewhere to put their hands. They sat on opposite ends of her couch. She was looking at him with the specific stillness of someone who had decided to wait without preemptively bracing. "Melissa called me last night," he said. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Subtle. "Okay." "She told me about a conversation she had with you, about 8 months into her and my relationship." He watched her face. "She asked you if you had feelings for me." Victoria's jaw tightened slightly. She said nothing. "And you told her no," he said. "Landon, she also told me that around the same time she asked me, not directly, but she asked me if I'd ever noticed anything different about you, if anything had ever seemed off." He held her gaze. "And I told her no." The silence stretched. "You told her no," Victoria said slowly. "Yes." "Why?" He set his tea down. "Because saying yes would have meant admitting something I'd decided not to admit. Because it felt easier to deny it and keep everything stable. Because I was scared." He said each of these things without looking away from her. All three, in that order. Victoria looked down at the mug in her hands. Her expression was doing something complicated, and she wasn't trying to hide it, which he noticed because she was usually so controlled. "I told her no," she said, "because she was my best friend, and she loved you, and I couldn't have that conversation with her. I thought I could just..." She stopped. "I thought I could just not have it be real, and then eventually it would stop being real." "Did it work?" "No." She set her mug on the coffee table. "Obviously not." "I know you were protecting her," he said. "I know that's what it came from." Don't. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Don't explain it back to me in the most generous version. I also told her no because I was afraid of what saying yes would have cost me. It wasn't entirely selfless. It wasn't entirely anything clean." "I know that too." She stood up. Not dramatically. She just needed to not be sitting. She moved to the window, the city behind her glass in its indifferent nighttime way. You denied it when she asked you, she said. You told her there was nothing there. With me. Yes. You made a choice. You chose stability, ease, whatever it was. You chose that over acknowledging what was actually true. Yes, he didn't qualify it. That's what happened. She was quiet for a long moment. When she turned back to him, her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't quite tears, but was in the neighborhood of them. I told myself a story, she said, that I was the only one feeling something impossible. That you were just kind, attentive, Landon, and I was projecting. And it helped, a little, believing that. Because it made me feel less... She pressed her lips together. Less foolish for not saying anything. You weren't foolish. I know that now. That's what's making this hard. She crossed her arms, not defensively, but like she needed to hold herself together with her own hands. We were both feeling the same thing, and we both buried it, and it didn't disappear. It just sat there, under everything, for 2 years. Yeah. And now you're telling me this because Melissa called you and told you to. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what actually happened, and because I wasn't going to build something with you on a version of events that was incomplete. He met her eyes. I could have not told you. Melissa wasn't going to. It would have just stayed buried. But that's the same thing I did last time, and I promised myself I was done choosing the easier thing. Victoria held his gaze for a long time. He watched something move through her expression. Hurt, recognition, something else he couldn't quite name. She wasn't giving him the easy response, and he wasn't asking for it. I need a minute, she said finally. Take whatever you need. She went to the kitchen. He heard water running. He sat on her couch and looked at the books on her shelves and the jacket on the chair and the reading glasses on the side table. And he waited, the way he'd been learning to wait, without filling the silence, without reaching for something to smooth it over. She came back after a few minutes with a glass of water and sat back down. Not at the far end this time, but closer, within arm's reach. I'm not angry at you, she said. You can be. I know I can be. I'm saying I'm not. She looked at her water. I don't know what I am yet exactly. I think I'm angry at the situation, at all of us, including myself. She looked up. We were all just scared. Different kinds of scared. And it made us all do the same wrong thing. Yeah, he said. The version where you'd never noticed me at all would have been easier, I think. She said it carefully, because then there was nothing to reckon with. But this... She shook her head slightly. This is harder, because you did notice, and you still chose to pretend you didn't. I know. He let that land without defending it. I don't have a better explanation than fear. I was afraid of what it would cost, and I picked safety. That was wrong. I'm not going to dress it up. She was quiet again. Not the closed-off kind of quiet. Something that was still processing, still moving. Why are you telling me? She said. The real reason, not just you deserve to know. Why now, when you didn't have to? He thought about Gracie's question in the park that day, months ago. Why do people who love each other hurt each other the most? He thought about his answer, about expectation and need, and the specific weight of caring what someone thinks of you. Because I'm not afraid of it anymore, he said. The cost of telling you the truth. I was afraid of it before, and I'm not now, and I think that's the thing that's actually changed. He looked at her. And because whatever we're building, I don't want it built on something I was too scared to say. Victoria sat with that. Outside, the city did what cities do. Continuous, indifferent, somehow both enormous and very small, depending on where you were standing. Okay, she said. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't a verdict. It was just the word that meant, I'm still here. I'm still in the room. I haven't decided what this is yet, but I haven't left. He could work with that. He stayed another hour. They talked about other things, not to avoid what had happened, but because the conversation needed somewhere to breathe after. She told him about the acquisition deal that had finally collapsed that afternoon. He told her that Gracie had apparently taught her two friends at school the incorrect version of chess he'd taught her, so there was now a third-grade chess circle operating on fundamentally flawed rules. Victoria laughed at that, genuinely, the real one. And the laugh didn't erase what had just happened between them, but it lived alongside it, which was something. When he left, she walked him to the door. They stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'm not done being complicated about this," she said. "I know. But I'm not—" She stopped. Started again. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded. "Neither am I." He took the slow elevator down and walked out through the lobby and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the November air, which was cold now in the specific way that November air gets when it means it. He put his hands in his pockets and looked up at the building, at the lit windows stacked on top of each other, all those contained lives. He thought about what it cost to tell the truth. Less than he'd expected. More than nothing. The exact right amount, probably. He walked to his car and drove home through the dark city, and the whole way back he felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly, not resolution, not any of the tidy emotions that wrap a moment up. Just the raw, imprecise feeling of having done the harder thing and still being standing afterward. It was enough. For tonight, it was enough. The complicated thing about "I'm not going anywhere" was that it didn't mean things were easy afterward. It meant they were willing to do the work while things were hard, which was a different promise and, in the long run, a more honest one. Victoria needed space in the days following that conversation. Not the punishing kind. She didn't go cold, didn't stop texting, didn't create the specific icy distance that signals someone building an exit. But there was a new carefulness in how she moved through their exchanges, a slight hesitation that hadn't been there before, and Landon noticed it and chose not to press it. He'd said what he needed to say. Now she was doing what she needed to do with it, and the only thing he could offer was the room to do that without him hovering at the edges asking if she was okay. He was getting better at that, staying in the question without rushing to resolve it. Gracie noticed that he was quieter than usual for a few days. She didn't comment on it directly. She'd absorbed at some point, without anyone telling her, that directly asking her father what was wrong produced less useful information than simply being nearby and patient. So she was nearby and patient, which looked like challenging him to chess every evening and accepting his increasingly mediocre play with a diplomacy that was somewhat devastating. "You lost your bishop for no reason," she said on a Wednesday night, studying the board with the focused disapproval of a small general. "I know. You do that when you're distracted." "I know, Gracie. Victoria's coming on Saturday, right?" He looked up at her. She said she'd try. Gracie moved her queen with great deliberation. "I think you should let her win sometimes," she said. I'm not. She doesn't play chess." "Dad." She looked at him with the specific expression she deployed when he was being obtuse. "I'm not talking about chess." He sat there for a moment. "When did you get this perceptive?" "I've always been this perceptive. You just don't always notice." She picked up her captured bishop and turned it over in her fingers. "She's nice. The real kind of nice, not the kind people do when they want you to like them." "Yeah," he said. "I know. So don't mess it up." "Thank you, Gracie. That's very helpful. I'm just saying." She put the bishop down and made her next move. Check. Victoria called him on Friday. Not a text, actually called, which had its own significance in the way that a call versus a text always does when you're paying attention to the signals people send without saying them directly. "I talked to Melissa," she said. He waited. "We had dinner last night." She sounded tired but not fractured, the voice of someone who'd gone through something difficult and come out the other side still standing, just a little worn at the edges. "We talked for about 3 hours, which is about 2 hours longer than I expected." "How did it go?" "Badly, then okay, then I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what we are now. We've been friends for 15 years and I think we're going to stay friends, but something changed and we both know it, and we're both pretending a little that it's fine when it's actually just different now." A pause. "She's not a bad person. She did something that came from fear and I did the same thing. We just did our fear-based things in the same direction. Victoria, I'm not calling for reassurance. I just wanted you to know I'd talk to her." Another pause, shorter. "She told me she was rooting for us. She meant it. I could tell." "Yeah." He thought about the phone call with Melissa, her careful voice, the specific exhaustion in it, the genuine warmth beneath everything. "I think she does." It's a strange situation. All of this has been a strange situation from the beginning. He heard something that was almost a laugh. That's true. Then, more quietly, I'm not punishing you. I want you to know that. What I've been doing this week isn't punishment. I know. I just needed to reconfigure some things in my head. She said it with the precision of someone who'd been trying to find the right word for a while. I had a version of the story I'd been telling myself, where I was the only one who felt something and kept it private for noble reasons. And that version was easier to live in because it made me the only one responsible for the silence. She paused again. The new version is more complicated, but I think it's more accurate. It is. And the accurate version is better, even when it's harder. Yeah, he said. I think so too. There was a beat of silence, comfortable, the kind they'd gotten used to. Gracie's expecting me Saturday, Victoria said. She is. She has an agenda. I don't know what it is, but she definitely has one. Should I be worried? Probably a little. She mentioned teaching you chess. I already know how to play chess. She doesn't know that yet. Let it be a gift to her. This time the laugh came through fully. Good night, Landon. Good night. December arrived, and with it the specific momentum that the end of a year produces. The sense of things being simultaneously concluded and unresolved, of time moving both slower and faster than it should. Landon's firm had a deadline push that had him working late 3 nights in a row. Victoria's acquisition fallout from the collapsed deal turned into a board-level conversation about strategic direction that she navigated with the focused exhaustion of someone steering a ship through familiar but rough water. They fit each other into the margins. Not as an afterthought, as a choice. The deliberate carving out of space in schedules that didn't naturally have room for anything that wasn't already scheduled. She came over on a Tuesday evening unannounced with takeout containers and the expression of someone who had been in meetings since 8 in the morning and had run out of the ability to make decisions, including the decision about dinner. He'd let her in, and they'd eaten at his kitchen table with Gracie, who had informed Victoria within the first 4 minutes about a new fact she'd learned, that certain species of jellyfish were biologically immortal, capable of reverting to their juvenile state under stress and starting the cycle over. So they just start over, Victoria had asked? Under certain conditions, stress usually triggers it. That's either amazing or terrifying. My teacher said fascinating, but I think it depends on whether you liked being young the first time. Gracie had said this with complete seriousness and then helped herself to more rice. Victoria had looked at Landon across the table. He'd made a face that meant, yes, this is what every meal is like, welcome. She'd made a face back that meant something he couldn't entirely decode, but which appeared to be in the vicinity of, I don't hate this at all. These were the ordinary things. The unremarkable accumulation of shared evenings and conversations about jellyfish and late-night texts and the gradual, unglamorous process of 2 people weaving themselves into each other's actual lives, rather than just the idea of each other. Then the social dimension arrived, as it eventually had to. It was a couple's dinner. 3 pairs of people he and Melissa had once attended these things, as including a woman named Claire who had been Melissa's college roommate and who texted Landon on a Thursday morning with an invitation that was warm on the surface and slightly pointed underneath. We're doing our usual December thing Saturday, she wrote. Would love to have you. And we heard you've been seeing Victoria. Please bring her if she's up for it. The more the merrier. He read it twice, showed it to Victoria that evening. She read it and said nothing for a moment, then, who's going to be there? Claire and her husband, Marcus and his partner, possibly Denise. Denise, who has strong opinions about everything. That Denise, yes. Victoria handed the phone back to him. These are all people who knew you and Melissa as a couple. Yes. And they know I was Melissa's best friend. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, doing the calculation he could see playing out across her expression. Not whether she could handle it, but whether she was ready to sit at a table and be looked at in this specific context, to field the particular quality of scrutiny that came from people who were curious and politely unable to say so. Do you want to go? She said. Not especially, but I also don't want to spend the next year avoiding every social event we have mutual history in. That's practical. I'm a practical person. She looked at him. You're really not, actually. You're practical in the structural engineering sense, but not in the emotional sense. You make decisions based on what's real, which is different. He considered this. Okay, fair. We should go, she said, not because I'm not slightly dreading it, but because the alternative is letting other people's curiosity shrink the space we live in. You want me to tell Claire we're coming? Tell Claire we're coming. The dinner was at Claire's house, a row home in the north side that was filled with the specific warmth of someone who made real effort, good lighting, flowers on the table that weren't from a grocery store, food that had been cooked rather than assembled. Landon had always liked Claire. She was the kind of person who made you feel expected and welcome without making a production of it. The others were already there when they arrived. He introduced Victoria as Victoria because she didn't need qualifying labels and he wasn't interested in providing them. Everyone knew who she was. The first hour was navigable. They ate and talked about things that didn't require anyone to say anything meaningful. The traffic situation in the city, someone's renovation, a film that 3 people had seen, and one person had strong, inexplicable opinions about, despite not having seen it. Victoria was good in social situations in a way that looked effortless, but probably wasn't. She asked questions that made people feel interesting, she laughed at the right moments, she managed the table's energy without visibly managing it. Landon watched her and thought, she does this all day, every day. The whole management of how people perceive her, how rooms feel when she's in them. And then she comes over on a Tuesday with takeout and runs out of decisions. He thought he understood something about her that he hadn't fully understood before. It was Denise who made it complicated, which was probably predictable. Denise was not malicious. That was the important thing to hold on to. But she was the kind of person who treated honesty as a virtue in ways that occasionally ran past the boundary of what honesty was for. She waited until the dinner plates were being cleared, the wine at a level where social filters were running lower than they had been at the start. And then she said, not meanly, but with the directness of someone who had decided the air needed clearing, can I just say something that everyone's probably thinking? Claire said, Denise, I just think it's worth acknowledging that this is a little bit of an unusual situation. Landon and Melissa were together for 3 years. Victoria was Melissa's best friend, and now you two are... She made a gesture that encompassed them both. I'm not saying it's wrong. I just think there's something to be said for naming it. The table went quiet in the specific way it does when someone has said the thing that changes the air pressure in the room. Victoria set her wine glass down with a deliberateness that was so controlled it communicated more than a loud response would have. When she spoke, her voice was even, not cold, but clear. You're right that it's not a conventional situation, she said, but I'm not sure what you'd like me to do with that observation. She looked at Denise without hostility. Melissa and I have talked. It was a difficult conversation, and I imagine we'll have more of them. But she and I are the people in that friendship, and that's where it gets worked out. I just think, Denise, and here Victoria's voice shifted, not louder, but with more underneath it. I've spent a long time making choices based on what seemed appropriate to the people around me. I'm trying to stop doing that. So I'm not going to sit here and justify something I don't think needs justifying. The silence that followed was uncomfortable and clarifying in equal measure. Marcus, who had said very little all evening, refilled his wine and said mildly, I thought the pasta was great, Claire, really. Claire grabbed the conversational lifeline with both hands. It's my grandmother's recipe. I'll send it to everyone. She started clearing plates with the focused energy of a hostess rescuing an evening. Landon looked at Victoria. She was looking at the table, her jaw slightly set. He reached under the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. They stayed another 40 minutes, which was long enough to demonstrate that they weren't leaving because of what had happened, and then they said their genuine thanks and goodbyes and walked out into the December air. On the sidewalk, Victoria exhaled, a long, slow release that was about more than the cold. That was the version I was dreading, she said. You handled it. I was rude. You were honest. Those are sometimes the same thing. She looked sideways at him. Are you mad at me? He stared at her. For what? for making it uncomfortable, for not just deflecting and keeping the peace. Victoria. He stopped walking. She stopped too. No, I'm not mad at you. He thought about how to say it. I'm glad you said it. I should have said something. I was sitting there trying to figure out how to, and you did it before I got there. She looked at him for a moment. We're going to have to do versions of that a lot, she said, for a while, until people get used to it. Yeah, probably. I'm not going to apologize every time someone's uncomfortable with our existence. Good, don't. She looked at him for another second. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, briefly, not dramatically, just for a moment. The kind of contact that's more about needing to be next to someone than any particular statement. He put his arm around her. They stood on the sidewalk in the December cold for a minute, the city doing its thing around them. Gracie texted me, Victoria said. He looked down at her. When? About an hour ago. She wanted to know if I was going to teach her a new opening tomorrow. She texted you. She has my number. You gave it to her in case of emergencies. That is not an emergency. No, Victoria said, but I'm going to teach her the Sicilian defense anyway. She lifted her head from his shoulder. If that's okay with you. He looked at her. This woman who ran a company and had a complicated friendship she was working to repair and had just held her ground in a dinner party conversation she hadn't wanted to have, standing on a sidewalk in December, asking if she could teach his daughter a chess opening. Yeah, he said. It's okay with me. They walked back to his car. The city moved around them the way it always did. Continuous, unaware, indifferent to the specific things that changed inside it while it kept running. Landon thought about all the decisions he'd made in his life out of fear, the times he'd chosen the smooth answer, the quiet option, the path that kept things from getting complicated. He thought about how much of his life had been shaped by the things he hadn't said, the feelings he'd filed under, not a good idea, and left there. He thought about Gracie saying, "Don't mess it up over a chessboard." He was trying. That was the honest answer. He was trying in the way that was harder than the version he'd been doing before. Not trying to manage outcomes, not trying to control how things looked, just trying to show up accurately and let that be enough. Victoria was quiet beside him in the car on the way home. Not uncomfortably, just the quiet of someone who'd used up a lot of energy and was letting themselves rest in the space where they didn't have to perform anymore. He didn't fill the silence. He drove. Outside, December was doing what December does. The lights on the buildings, the cold clarity of the air, the particular feeling of a year running toward its end, with everything still unresolved that was going to stay unresolved, and everything still possible that was going to stay possible. He dropped her off at her building. She leaned over and kissed him. Quick, real, the kind of thing that didn't announce itself. Tell Gracie I'll bring a proper chess clock, she said, getting out. She's going to be insufferable about it. I'm counting on it. She went inside. He waited until the lobby doors closed behind her. Then he sat in the car for a moment with the engine running and the heat on and the quiet settling around him, and he thought about the strange distance between the life you're afraid to reach for and the life you actually have when you stop being afraid. It wasn't perfect. None of it was. There were conversations still ahead that were going to be hard, adjustments still to be made, a friendship being rebuilt by two women he cared about in completely different ways. There was Gracie to think about, always, and what it meant to let someone into the life they'd built together, and whether that was the right thing, and whether it was going to hold. There was all of that, and it was real, and it was complicated, and it was his. He put the car in drive, went home through the December streets, through the city that never fully went quiet, through the ordinary and specific life he was finally, imperfectly, carefully, for real this time, trying to build. The Sicilian defense turned out to be the beginning of something Landon hadn't anticipated. Victoria came over on that Sunday with a small chess clock, the real kind, with 2 buttons and a satisfying mechanical click, and set it on the kitchen table with the seriousness of someone initiating a formal proceeding. Gracie had looked at it with the exact expression she got when something exceeded her expectations, which was a kind of stunned approval she rarely bothered to conceal. They played for 2 hours. Landon made coffee and stayed mostly out of it, occasionally looking up from the papers he was pretending to read to find them hunched over the board in matching postures, both leaning forward on their elbows, both frowning at the same middle distance, both completely absorbed. At one point, Gracie captured Victoria's knight with a move that made Victoria sit back and say, "Where did that come from?" with genuine surprise. And Gracie had said, "I've been practicing," with an absolute straightness of face that made Landon put his coffee down and look at the ceiling for a moment. After the game, while Gracie was putting the pieces away with the reverence she reserved for objects she considered serious, Victoria had caught his eye across the kitchen. She hadn't said anything. She just looked at him with an expression that carried something too settled and certain to be called happiness exactly, more like recognition. Like she'd arrived somewhere and knew it. He'd felt it too. That was in December. By February, she had a drawer in his apartment. Not a big drawer, a single drawer in the bathroom cabinet that had accumulated over a period of 6 weeks, a face wash, a spare phone charger, a tube of hand cream, and a paperback she'd been reading in installments. He hadn't suggested it. She hadn't asked. It had just happened the way real things happen, incrementally and without announcement. And one day he'd noticed it and understood that it was the truest measure of where they were. Not the dinners or the texts or the conversations that ran past midnight, but a drawer in a bathroom cabinet that said, "I come here enough that I need a place." Gracie had discovered the drawer one morning and examined its contents with scientific thoroughness, then reported to Landon that Victoria's hand cream smelled like cedar and something else she couldn't identify. He told her that wasn't really information she needed to be collecting. She told him she was just observing. He told her to please stop observing other people's drawers. She'd moved on, but with the air of someone who had filed the data away for future reference. Life in those months had a texture that was new without being unfamiliar, like a room you hadn't been in before that still somehow felt like yours. Victoria's schedule was demanding in ways that didn't always flex, and Landon's had its own rigidities, and they had to work around each other's hard edges without pretending the edges weren't there. There were evenings when she was sharp with him because she'd had a difficult day and hadn't yet learned to separate the residue of it from the people she came home to. There were mornings when he was withdrawn in the specific way he got when he was carrying something he hadn't sorted out yet and couldn't fully articulate, and she'd learned, slowly, with some friction, to not push at it directly but to just stay nearby and let it move on its own. They weren't always good at each other. That was the honest truth of it. They were learning. Melissa came to dinner in March. It had been Victoria's idea, proposed carefully over the phone one evening with the tentativeness of someone who has thought through something for a long time and still isn't entirely sure of the landing. "I want to have Melissa over," she said, "for dinner, at your place." A pause on his end. "All 3 of us." "Yes." "Okay," he said. "If that's what you want?" "I think it's what I need. There's a version of this where we all just exist in separate compartments, and it works logistically but feels dishonest, and I'm tired of things that feel dishonest." "Yeah." He thought about it. "I'll make something good. You don't have to make something elaborate. I'm going to make something elaborate." She paused. "Okay." Melissa arrived with wine and the particular brightness of someone who was trying hard and not entirely hiding the effort. She looked well. She'd married Daniel in a small ceremony in January that Landon had sent a card for, and Victoria had attended as the only person in the room who'd occupied both orbits. And she had the settled quality of someone who had found, at last, the thing they'd been reaching toward. The evening was not easy and not terrible. There were moments of genuine warmth and moments where the air in the room required careful navigation, and the 3 of them moved through it with the collective awareness of people who understood that certain things couldn't be rushed. They ate. They talked about things adjacent to the things they couldn't talk about directly, and then eventually they talked about some of those too. At one point, while Landon was in the kitchen and they thought he couldn't hear, he caught fragments of Melissa and Victoria talking quietly at the table. Not the words exactly, but the register of it. The particular cadence of 2 women who had known each other for 15 years working through something that had layers and cost and history. He stayed in the kitchen longer than he needed to. When he came back out, they were both looking at something on Victoria's phone, and Melissa was laughing. A real laugh, the kind that didn't have anything complicated attached to it. And Victoria was laughing too, and it wasn't resolved, whatever was between them. It probably never would be completely, but it was something real. It was them still trying. Landon set the plates down and sat back in his chair and thought, This is what it looks like. Not resolved, just real. Gracie, who had eaten with them and then been sent to her room with her book, appeared in the doorway at 9 o'clock with her stuffed seal and the stated intention of saying goodnight. She hugged Landon. She said goodnight to Victoria with the comfort of habit. Then she turned to Melissa and studied her for a moment with the direct appraisal only a child can deploy without it being rude. "Hi," Gracie said. "Hi," Melissa said. "I've heard a lot about you." "I know some things about you too," Gracie said, and then apparently decided that covered the introduction and went back to her room. Melissa looked at Landon. "She's terrifying," she said. "I mean that as a compliment." "She gets that a lot," Landon said. Victoria just smiled at her plate. Dorchet. Spring arrived the way it does in the city. Not all at once, but in negotiations. Cold days giving ground to warmer ones, and then briefly taking it back, until one morning you step outside and the air has definitively changed, and you realize you've stopped waiting for it. Landon noticed it on a walk to the corner store with Gracie in April, the way the trees on the block had made their decision overnight, and Gracie had stopped in front of one and put her hand against the bark with the solemnity of a scientist confirming data. "They were just waiting," she said. "The trees?" "For the right conditions." She looked up at the branches. "They don't rush it. They just wait until everything is actually ready." He'd looked at her standing there in her rain boots in April, touching a tree on a sidewalk, and felt something that was too big and too ordinary at the same time to have a name for. "Yeah," he said. "I think that's right." Victoria had been asked in March to give a keynote at a charity art gala that Meridian Capital was sponsoring, an annual event that raised money for arts education programs in underfunded schools across the city. She'd done it the year before. She was doing it again this year, but this year the event was also debuting a permanent installation that Meridian's foundation had commissioned, a series of large format paintings by a local artist named Sarah Voss, whose work Victoria had been following for years. She mentioned the gala to Landon the way she mentioned most things connected to work, as information rather than invitation, not wanting to presume. He told her he was coming. She told him he didn't have to. He told her he knew that. She told him the dress code was smart casual. He told her he owned one blazer. "The gray one," she said. "That's the one." A pause. "Wear it." He brought Gracie, which had been his mother's suggestion, who had pointed out with her specific brand of gentle accuracy that Gracie was at the age where she should be seeing what people did with their lives beyond the immediate vicinity of school and home. He'd mentioned this to Victoria, who had said she'd love that, in a tone that didn't perform the statement, just meant it. The gala was held in a converted warehouse space in the arts district that had been transformed for the evening into something genuinely beautiful. High ceilings strung with warm light, the paintings arranged along the walls in an arrangement that gave each one room to breathe. The crowd was the particular mix these events produced. People with money, people with art. People who moved between those two worlds with the professional ease of people who'd been doing it long enough that it felt natural. Landon arrived with Gracie, who had dressed herself in what she described as professional but interesting. A dark green dress that had been a birthday gift and her rain boots because some negotiations were simply not worth having. He'd decided not to fight the boots. Victoria found them near the entrance. She was in a deep blue dress with her hair up in the way she wore it for professional occasions, and she moved through the room with the assurance of someone on her home territory. But when she reached them, she crouched slightly to be at Gracie's level, which Landon had noticed she always did without seeming to think about it. "Nice boots," she said to Gracie. "I know," Gracie said. Victoria straightened and looked at Landon. He looked back at her. There was a moment, brief, uncomplicated, where they were just two people standing in a room being glad the other one was there. "Come on," she said. "I want to show you the paintings." The paintings by Sarah Voss were large enough that you had to stand back to take them in, but close enough to feel the texture of them, the deliberateness of each brushstroke. They were all city scenes technically, but abstracted in a way that made them feel more like memory than documentation. Rain on glass, light on wet pavement. The particular blur of a city at night seen from a moving car. Landon walked along the wall and stopped. The third painting in the series was larger than the others. It showed a city street at night from inside a car. The windshield rain-streaked, the city beyond it rendered in streaks of light and dark, the interior of the car just visible in the foreground. There were two figures. They were not detailed, not portraits, more like shapes that implied presence, the suggestion of two people in a contained space with the world dissolving outside. He stood in front of it for a while. Victoria appeared beside him. She looked at the painting too. "Did you?" he started. "I told her the image," she said, "the night at the engagement party. Driving past my street in the rain, I didn't tell her what it meant or who the people were. I just described what it looked like. She did the rest." He studied the painting, the way the rain turned the city into something impressionistic, something felt rather than seen. The way the two shapes inside the car were turned slightly toward each other in a way that was barely perceptible but unmistakable once you saw it. "Why?" he said. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Because it's where things started to be real. And I wanted—" She paused. "I spend a lot of my professional life making things that are measurable. Deals, numbers, portfolios, things you can point to and quantify. And I wanted one thing that just existed, that said this happened and it mattered without a return on investment attached to it." He looked at her. "It matters," he said. "I know." She kept looking at the painting. "I know it does." Gracie appeared between them and stood in front of the painting with her hands clasped behind her back in the posture she adopted when she was considering something seriously. The three of them stood there together, and Landon was aware of it as a moment, not in the sentimental manufactured sense, but in the real sense of being briefly conscious of what you have while you have it. "Is that supposed to be a car?" Gracie said. "Yes," Victoria said. "It doesn't look like a car." "No, but it feels like one, I think." Gracie considered this. "I think I understand that," she said, with the tone of someone deciding to extend the benefit of the doubt to abstract art, and then moved on to the next painting. Later in the evening, after the keynote, which Victoria delivered with the crisp authority of someone who had been doing this long enough to make it look unconstructed, though Landon knew from the 3 evenings she'd spent revising it how much work was underneath. And after the dinner portion and the dancing that happened at the far end of the room, which Gracie participated in with complete commitment and zero self-consciousness, they ended up outside on the building's side terrace. Just the two of them, briefly, while Gracie had been absorbed into a group of other children whose parents were also hiding on terraces. The city was visible over the low roofline, the usual density of it, all those lit windows stacked against the dark sky. "You were good tonight," Landon said. "The keynote. I was adequate. I was funnier at the rehearsal." "You were funny tonight. The joke about the acquisition didn't land." "It landed. People just weren't sure if they were allowed to laugh." She leaned against the railing. "That's worse." "A little," he admitted. She looked at him sideways. "Thank you for coming." "Of course." "No, I mean—" She paused, and something in her expression shifted into the more careful register she used when she was saying something she'd been thinking about for a while. "Thank you for being the kind of person who comes, who shows up for things. Not because it's easy or convenient, but because it matters." She looked back at the city. "I haven't had that. Not in a long time. Maybe not ever, from someone who wasn't obligated to." He was quiet for a moment. "You've had it. You just didn't always let people close enough to offer it." She made a sound that acknowledged the truth of this without entirely accepting it. "I'm working on that." "I know you are." She turned to look at him. The terrace light made her face look different than it did inside. Softer somehow, or maybe just more private. "Landon? Yeah. I love you." She said it the way she said things she'd decided to stop being afraid of, directly, without decorating it or burying it in qualifications. Just the fact of it, offered plainly. He looked at her. He thought about a woman asking him to drive past her street. He thought about a parking lot in the rain and the specific weight of 2 people deciding to stop pretending. He thought about chess clocks on kitchen tables and drawers in bathroom cabinets and Tuesday evenings with takeout containers and conversations about jellyfish and all the small, specific, unremarkable accumulations that turn out to be the actual substance of love when you're paying attention. He thought about Gracie saying they wait until everything is actually ready. "I love you," he said. Not as a response, not as an echo, as its own thing, stated on its own terms. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the city, and he stayed beside her, and they didn't say anything for a while because some things settle better in silence than they do in words. Inside, through the glass doors, he could see Gracie and a girl roughly her age having what appeared to be a serious discussion about something, Gracie's hands doing their characteristic thing, the other girl listening with the focused intensity of someone receiving important information. He watched her and thought about all the ways this kid had been his entire world for 8 years. The thing he'd been building around, building for, the fixed point that everything else oriented toward. He thought about how afraid he'd been, for a long time, that introducing something new into that fixed point would destabilize it somehow, would shift the weight and tip something over. It hadn't. The weight had redistributed. That was the word for it. Not replaced, not crowded, redistributed, spread across a wider surface, which turned out to make everything more stable, not less. He'd had it wrong. He'd thought love was a fixed quantity that got divided. It wasn't. It expanded. He didn't have less to give Gracie because he was giving something to Victoria. He had more, actually. More range, more patience, more understanding of what it meant to choose someone deliberately rather than out of proximity or convenience or the fear of running out of time. He'd gotten to 32 believing his best shot had passed, that the version of his life where he got to be fully himself, not just the father, not just the engineer, not just the responsible manager of a life that worked, had been used up in the years before, spent on attempts that didn't quite take, that what was left was maintenance, competent, loving, meaningful maintenance, but maintenance nonetheless. He'd been wrong about that too. The gala wound down after 10. They collected Gracie, who had exchanged information with the other girl, and announced that her name was Priya and that they were going to be friends, delivered with the certainty of someone who has made a business decision and considers it finalized. Landon did not doubt this. They said goodnight to the remaining people, including a brief exchange with Sarah Voss herself, the artist, a small, direct woman in her 40s who shook Landon's hand and said, without any preamble, "I hear you're the other person in the painting." He'd said he supposed he was. She'd looked at him for a moment with the evaluating look of an artist deciding whether reality matched the image. Apparently it satisfied something, because she'd nodded once and turned to find someone else to talk to. In the car on the way home, Gracie fell asleep between blocks, the absolute immediate sleep of a child who has been at full capacity all evening and simply shuts off when it's done. She was sideways in her seat, the stuffed seal, which had been in her bag all evening, now clutched to her chest, her hair a disaster. Landon glanced in the rearview mirror. Victoria was looking at Gracie too from the passenger seat, with an expression Landon had never seen on her face in any boardroom or dinner party or professional context. Something completely unguarded, something that had no performance in it at all. He looked back at the road. "She's going to ask about Priya every day for the next 2 weeks," he said quietly. "We should get them together. She'll start planning it before she's fully awake in the morning." Victoria smiled at the windshield. She should. They drove through the spring night, the city doing its indifferent and continuous and somehow deeply personal thing around them. The lights on the bridge they crossed were their usual amber, the river below doing whatever rivers do, dark and moving and indifferent to the fact that directly above it, in a Volvo SUV with a cracked dashboard panel, 3 people were making their way home. He dropped Victoria at her building. She touched his hand before she got out, held it for a second, not dramatically, just a fact. "Come for dinner Sunday," he said. "I'll bring groceries." "You don't have to." "I want to cook," she said. "Let me cook." "Gracie's going to give you notes." "I'm aware." She opened the door. "Good night, Landon." "Good night." She went inside. He watched the lobby door close. In the back seat, Gracie turned over without waking and made a small sound and settled again. He drove home. Here is what he knew by the end of it, the real things, the ones that cost something to learn, and therefore meant something to hold. Fear is the most ordinary thing in the world. Every person he'd ever known with any honesty had been run by it at some point. The fear of being wrong, the fear of wanting too much, the fear of letting someone see the actual version of themselves rather than the curated one. Fear was not a character flaw. It was just what happened when something mattered enough to lose. The problem was when you let it make your decisions. When you answered no when the truth was more complicated. When you drove past someone's street and then couldn't figure out why you were still thinking about it years later. When you built a case against a feeling so thoroughly that you believed the case more than the feeling, and the feeling stayed anyway, underneath, patient as a tree, waiting for the right conditions. He'd done that. Victoria had done that. Melissa had done that, in her own way. They were all just people trying to protect themselves from the specific pain of wanting something they weren't sure they could have, and the protection had cost them years they couldn't get back. But here was the other thing, the part that mattered as much. It hadn't been too late. That was the fact he hadn't been sure of, standing at his kitchen counter looking at an engagement party invitation for 11 days. Whether anything was still possible, whether the window had closed, whether he was too far into the kind of life that runs on routine and responsibility to let anything genuinely new enter it. It hadn't been too late. Not for any of them. The truth was that most of the things people believed were too late actually weren't. They were just harder than they would have been earlier, and the additional difficulty felt like evidence of impossibility when it was actually just the cost of the delay. Payable. Manageable. Worth it. You had to tell the truth when it was easier not to. Not the truth deployed as a weapon, not honesty performing itself for its own sake, but the real kind. The kind you say because the person across from you deserves to know what's actually happening, and because you can't build anything real on a foundation that has a hole in it. You had to choose the harder thing on purpose. Not all the time, not as a philosophy, but in the moments when the harder thing was the more honest thing. You had to drive past the street instead of stopping. You had to sit in a parking lot in the rain and say something you'd spent years not saying. You had to call your ex and tell him something he needed to tell someone else, even when it was complicated, because complicated and right are not mutually exclusive, and sometimes they're exactly the same thing. And you had to let people in past the version of yourself you'd decided was manageable. The put-together CEO with the successful firm and the elegant wardrobe and the professional composure, that was real, but it wasn't the whole person. The whole person came over on a Tuesday with takeout and ran out of decisions. The whole person had a drawer in a bathroom cabinet and a standing chess appointment with an 8-year-old and an opinion about the Sicilian defense that she held with the same conviction she brought to quarterly earnings reports. The whole person was the part worth loving. The rest was just impressive. Landon Hayes was 32 years old when a woman asked him to drive past her street. He would be 33 in June. He was a structural engineer who triple-checked his work out of fear and a father who watched his daughter breathe in the doorway at night, doing the unconscious accounting of a parent who knows what they would lose if they lost it. He was a person who had spent a long time choosing the easier thing and then had to reckon with that, and who had chosen, imperfectly, effortfully, with full awareness of what it cost, to stop. He was not particularly remarkable. He knew that. He was not wealthy or exceptional, or the kind of man around whom extraordinary things naturally accumulated. He was just a person who had learned, late and at some expense, that showing up honestly was the most important skill available to a human being, and that it was learnable at any point, and that its results were not guaranteed but were more reliable than the alternative. He had a daughter who asked unanswerable questions and had decided that a CEO was going to be her friend. He had a woman who loved him in the direct, uncomplicated way she did things she'd decided to stop being afraid of. He had a cracked dashboard he was still not going to fix because by now it had become a landmark, a way of marking time. He had a life that had not gone the way he'd planned and had turned into something he wouldn't trade. That Sunday, Victoria cooked. It was pasta. Not elaborate, not effortful in the showy sense, just genuinely made with attention. She and Gracie moved around his kitchen with the easy negotiated rhythm of people who had been working out the choreography for months and had mostly figured it out. Gracie handing things when asked, occasionally offering opinions about seasoning that Victoria received with the seriousness they apparently deserved. He sat at the kitchen table and did nothing useful and watched them, The window over the sink showed the backyard, the old swing set he was definitely going to replace this summer, the sky doing the specific early spring thing where it looked clean in a way that didn't last. The kitchen smelled like garlic and something bright, lemon maybe, and the radio was on low to something nobody had consciously selected. "You're not helping," Gracie said, not looking up from her task of very precisely tearing basil leaves into what she had decided were the correct sizes. "I know," Landon said. "Victoria said she doesn't mind, but she minds a little." "I don't mind," Victoria said. "You said you minded a little." "I said it might be nice if he set the table." "That's minding." Landon got up and set the table. Later, they ate. The pasta was good, actually good, not politely good, and Gracie said so with the directness she applied to all assessments, which meant Victoria received it as the genuine compliment it was. They talked about Priya and the play date that had been scheduled for the following weekend, and a documentary Gracie had found about migratory birds that she wanted both of them to watch, and the chess tournament at her school in May that she had decided to enter. "You should coach her," Landon told Victoria. "She doesn't need coaching. She needs an opponent who doesn't let her win." "I don't let her win," he said. They both looked at him. "I occasionally make suboptimal moves," he said. "Dad," Gracie said, "you let me take your queen last week. That was a strategic sacrifice." "It was not a strategic sacrifice." Victoria pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was not going to laugh, but was going to allow herself to be visibly amused. Gracie looked at Landon with the patience of someone who has accepted that the people they love are imperfect and has chosen to love them anyway. He looked at both of them, this woman, this kid, his specific and improbable and thoroughly real life, and felt something that had no name he could settle on. Not happiness exactly, not in the simple sense. Something that had weight and texture and history to it. Something that had been earned, not given. Outside, the light was doing what it did in early spring evenings. That particular angle that made everything look slightly more itself than usual, more present, more worth paying attention to. Landon Hayes had believed for a long time that the window had closed, that the version of the life where things were fully alive was behind him, spent. He'd been wrong. The window had been open the whole time. He just had to stop driving past his own street.